And with that, I will turn it over to Ivonne del Valle, my colleague from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and one of the organizers of the symposium, to chair the next session.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to the ongoing revolution inside and outside of Mexico. And we're going to start with Barry Carr. Barry was educated at Oxford, where he received his BA and his doctorate. He taught Latin American history at Latrobe University in Melbourne, Australia, from 1972 to 2008, where he founded and directed the Institute of Latin American Studies. And now the history department here at Berkeley is lucky to have him as a visiting professor. He works on 20th century history of Latin America with a special interest in labor and agrarian history of Mexico and Cuba, the history of socialism, communism, anarchism in Latin America, and the history of transnational networks and communities of radicals, revolutionaries, exiles, and vanguard intellectuals in the Caribbean from the 1920s to the 1940s, and more recently on the emergence and development of the pink tide, or the shift to the left in Latin America. And I think that with this list of interests, we can see where his leanings are.
I'm a tea bagger.
Yeah. His recent books...
Sorry, tea party, I got it wrong.
Well, his recent books include Marxism and Communism in 20th Century Mexico, which is an indispensable book to understand the impact of these movements in Mexico. Also, The Cuba Reader, Politics, History, and Literature. And he's currently co-editing The Resurgence of Latin American Radicalism Between Cracks in the Empire and the Izquierda Permitida. Welcome.
You didn't come out, you didn't follow through with your threat to describe me as a what was it that term you came up with? Hardcore communist or whatever? Okay, well, whatever that is. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I think the title of my presentation was to be Transnationalizing the Mexican Revolution, Mexico as a hub in radical revolutionary and anti-imperialist networks, 1910, 1945, or maybe it's 1954. There are various versions of this. There's been a slight modification, just in terms of chronology here. I think I'm going to be able to handle this presentation in 20 minutes rather than 25, but they're famous last words, so don't hold me to those too much. But we have a very disciplined chairperson, I think, who's going to help there. This talk is part of course, that's the famous first words of so many thousands of papers. This talk is part of a larger project on the history of transnational networks of radicals, revolutionaries, exiles, and vanguard intellectuals in the greater Caribbean area, the greater Circumcaribe, in the period between the two great world wars, with the focus being very much on the 1920s and 1930s. And I'm using that term, the greater Circumcaribbean, because I'm running out of, as others have been, we're running out of adequate ways of referring to this space. Because what interests me is not only the insular the Caribbean, the islands of the Caribbean, Central America, parts of Mexico, which are traditionally regarded as part of the Caribbean, but what some people call the continental Caribbean, parts of Venezuela and Colombia, and especially important, parts of the United States, particularly the east coast of the United States and the southern half of the United States, certainly the area that's Louisiana, also a part of this very large geographical space that interests me. This project that I'm working with is part of what I suppose we now call the transnational turn. I'm very suspicious of turns in general. I mean, I've been turning or being persuaded to turn so many times, I don't know where I am. But I think the transnational turn is one of the most fruitful of these turns of the last 20, 25 years. It's not though perhaps as original as some people make out. Many people have been doing transnational history work without necessarily realizing that that's what they've been doing. But I do find it interesting to go to find a kind of authorization from the academy to move beyond the nation state, to spend more time crossing borders. Crossing borders, of course, is one of those tropes that appears in so many articles and books and conferences within a transnational theme. And not crossing borders, not just in the borderlands itself, where there's been some very interesting work, the Mexico-US borderlands. I am interested in backwards and forwards movements, this toing and froing of flows of people, flows of ideas, flows of practices. And I'm also interested in the unexpected, the frequently unexpected consequences of some of these flows. In what some people used to call, the literary theory people used to call the Empire Strikes Back. Have also become quite interested in recent years in what historians might be able to do with network theory, which is really a kind of body of writing pioneered primarily by a certain branch of sociology, but it's been taken up by political science, particularly international relations, and anthropology. I'm not sure they're going to have time to really talk about what some of the advantages and disadvantages of the network theory is, especially for historians who tend not to work with the very rich data sets that network theory tends to demand, especially if you're a sociologist. But I have found some of the issues and questions raised by the networkers, the academic networkers, interesting. I've become interested in the course of this research in the role played by certain cities that emerged as particularly sensitive, so particularly rich centers of attraction for the protagonists that I'm studying. Places that acted as a magnet for radicals and revolutionaries of all kinds. And the kinds of people that have interested me in recent years are the people who are the carriers of the isms, the anarchists, wobblies, those members of the industrial workers of the world, socialists, communists, but Garveyites, black nationalist movement in the United States, very important in this region, of all kinds, and exiles, many of them vanguard intellectuals as well. The people that are interesting me are not simply reducible to the political sphere of people who are politically engaged in a narrow sense of that word. Many of them are vanguard intellectuals, and while I don't, this is not the occasion or time really to define that term, but since there are literature people here, and I have to be kind of very careful and to be on my best behavior when using that term, I'm referring by vanguard intellectuals to those writers, poets, and artists who go beyond, who went beyond what literary scholars would call the vanguardist experimentation with new vocabularies and styles that emerged everywhere in Latin America in the 1920s, late teens and 1920s. So I'm trying to go beyond that to those vanguardists who also embraced various kinds of political radicalism associated with new collective practices in which, and here's a quotation from a distinguished Argentinian writer here, Fernanda Baigel, who says that the literary vanguards that we are interested in go beyond practices in which the artistic tertulias cease to be, and it's a quotation here, instancias aristocráticas de consagración de poetas cursi, the alta sociedad, instead becoming, again quotation, centros de discusión doctrinaria de recepción de las novedades políticas internacionales. Many of the people who figure in the networks that interest me are people who are part of those increasingly politicized literary networks. And network is a very important term here. Now, there are a number of these urban hubs, and using the word hub already is a kind of commitment to using some of the vocabulary of the social network sort of theorists who use a very, very particular and private vocabulary. One of those hubs is New York in the United States, and to some degree Tampa in Florida. Another is Havana in Cuba. And to leave the Circumcaribe for a moment, Buenos Aires in Argentina is another of those very, very important hubs. So it actually is an important part of the story here, although I'm not going to be referring to that. But by far the biggest of the hubs in these networks was Mexico City. Now, although the announced title of my talk refers to a longish time period through to the 1940s, early 1950s, I'm only going to be talking here about the 1920s, but I mean, there's a much, much longer history here. Now, there's long been an academic interest in the gaze and presence of foreigners attracted by what Mexico and Mexico City meant, what Mexico and Mexico City meant in the revolutionary era, the first 2 decades, 3 decades of the Mexican Revolution. But most of this work has understandably centered on the North American gaze. And I'm thinking here of the work of pioneer historians like Helen Delpar, who wrote a very influential book about 20 years ago, and more recently Mauricio Tenorio of the University of Chicago, of course the university is represented here at this conference, who has been exploring this phenomenon using the term the brown Atlantis, to describe the appeal of Mexico City to those constituencies, to these same constituencies. In using the term brown Atlantis, and the same is true of Helen Delpar's pioneering work, the emphasis is very firmly focused on the emergence of Mexico as the center of indigenous politics, art, and philosophy. Now, I've suggested to Mauricio somewhat cheekily that Havana played a similar role in the 1920s and 1930s, although it's a less substantial role than Mexico City, and that the label in this case might be the black Atlantis, given the passion and fashion for things African or African-centric or African-descended in Cuba in the 1920s and 1930s, a passion that brought to Havana also endless flows of intellectuals, activists, musicians, artists, and so on. Our attention, though, as I just noted, veers more traditionally to US artists, writers, folklorists, and activists and intellectuals who are captured in some ways by Mexico and Mexico City. Some of the names of the people who came south of the border to Mexico City in the 20s and 30s are very, very well known. People like William Spratling, the great silver pioneer in Tasco, Francis Tour and Anita Brenner, 2 very well-known folklorists who are also very closely associated with the world of the political left. Tina Modotti and Edward Weston, the photographer. Carlton Beals, a perennial traveler on the US, Mexico, and Latin American circuit. The husband and wife team, Ella and Bertrand Wolfe. And a steady streams of US painters and muralists, as well as a lesser-known stream of what one might call, I have to be careful about the expression here, sexual pilgrims, attracted by the allegedly, but not really in practice, more open and tolerant atmosphere for same-sex relations from the late 1920s onwards, and especially in the 1940s and 1950s. This latter stream combined at some points with the arrival of some of the US beats, the beat poets of the 1940s and 1950s and early 1960s. William Burroughs being the most important of these, but to a lesser degree, Kerouac and Ginsberg are also involved here, for whom Mexico was an obsession. Then there were the political refugees from the US who fled to Mexico during the McCarthyite period of the late 1940s and 1950s. To Mexico City, but then after the Second World War, the imagination of foreigners tends to move beyond Mexico City. Before Mexico City, before the 1940s, it's really Mexico City that attracts foreigners, but after, with the possible exception of Tasco. But after the 1940s, these exiles, refugees, activists go to towns like Cuernavaca, and that have been studied, these groups have been studied recently by a couple of US scholars. I'm thinking here of Diana Anhalt, whose book, A Gathering of Fugitives, and more recently, a very good book by Rebecca Schreiber called Cold War Exiles in Mexico, US Dissidents and the Culture of Critical Resistance. If you haven't read that book, please, I recommend that you read it. Now, the presence of non-Americans, however, whether they be Europeans or Latin Americans, has been much less well registered and studied. Although there has been some work on, for example, the massive arrival of anti-fascist intellectuals and politicians during World War II, which turned Mexico City from about 1940 onwards into what was by far the most dynamic and cosmopolitan cultural center in the Americas. That's, of course, a natural segue to remembering and celebrating the life and career of Friedrich Katz, who makes his first appearance in Mexico with his parents during the Second World War. And I should note here that there are many other kind of vectors after the period I'm going to be talking about now, including an anti-communist left, which is very, very important, that also gathers in Mexico City and some other areas in the Caribbean, and that's been studied by Patrick Iber. I'm not sure Patrick is here at the moment, but he was here in the morning. So Mexico City, Emporium of Revolution, it's been called by somebody, and I can't remember the reference now, Emporium of Revolution. Mexico City attracted exiles, emigres, refugees, revolutionaries, and dreamers throughout the 1920s, and even before. There were pull and push factors involved here. The Álvaro Obregón government, 1921 to 24, its embrace of literacy campaigns, educational and artistic vanguardism, was part of this magnet's attractive powers. No one was more powerfully instrumental in creating this pull than José Vasconcelos, Obregón's Minister of Education. Modeling himself in part on the Soviet Union's cultural Tsar, Anatoly Lunacharsky, Vasconcelos used his position to make the Ministry of Education a cultural patron of muralists and educators from all over the Americas. Most of the clients recruited into the muralism and education endeavors were Mexicans, but there was also a steady stream of Latin American cultural vanguardists and activists as well. The Chilean poet and educator Gabriela Mistral was one of these. She arrived in Mexico and spent a brief period there in 1923. A somewhat less well-known member of this emporium was the Nicaraguan writer Salomón de la Selva, who later in the 1920s became a supporter of Sandino's cause in Nicaragua, and then went on to a very interesting career in later years. Vasconcelos himself, at this phase in his career, embraced nationalist and anti-imperialist struggles in Mexico, but also in the Caribbean as well, especially those of Haiti and Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Vasconcelos is actually a delegate to the Comintern organized, the conference organized by the Communist International, organized Anti-Imperialist Congress in Brussels in February 1927. It's a little-known feature of Vasconcelos' biography. We tend to forget about this dimension of Vasconcelos' political trajectory as our attention is understandably drawn to the more conservative shift in Vasconcelos' political views and his embrace of frankly reactionary politics in the 1930s, what already is clear in 1929 and beyond. Another of the cultural figures who found their way to Mexico City in Vasconcelos' network was the young Peruvian intellectual and anti-imperialist Aya de la Torre, the founder of the APRA movement, who was forced into exile in 1923 by the increasingly repressive government of Augusto Leguía. Aya also embraced Vasconcelos' project and became his Vasconcelos' de facto private secretary for a number of months. And he borrowed from Vasconcelos' unfolding nationalist cosmology a number of key concepts, like Indo-Latino and Indo-Americano, or Indo-America, the latter of which became one of the corner pieces of Aya de la Torre's own anti-imperialist project, albeit without the Hispanophile bits of Vasconcelos' vision of the cosmic race. Aya de la Torre's own anti-imperialism project came to fruition, in fact, in Mexico. The project of APRA began in Mexico City in 1924. At least there was a first chispa of that in 1924. The ongoing repression of the Leguía government, one of many oligarchic regimes in the 1920s all over Latin America, would produce a steady stream of political refugees from Peru, particularly between 1924 and 29. Most of them involved politically with either Aya de la Torre or with the young Marxist intellectual José Carlos Mariátegui. Among these later Peruvian arrivals were poets like Magda Portal, a not as well-known person as she should be, the person who's sometimes referred to as La Pasionaria Peruana, who would become a powerful advocate of women's political agency in the APRA movement in Peru in the 1930s and 1940s. She arrived in Mexico in 1927 after a proceso comunista, a series of trials and witch hunts directed against the Peruvian left by the Leguía government, which initiated another wave of deportation and exiles. In fact, there were lots of procesos comunistas all over Latin America in 1927. The other famous one occurred in Machado, in Gerardo Machado's Cuba. Also with the inevitable sequela of an increase in the velocity of circulation of exiles. There was a Peruvian Jewish activist for a while, aprista Jacobo Hurwitz, another Peruvian, Esteban Pavletic, another aprista who spent a year also fighting with the Nicaraguan guerrilla leader, an anti-imperialist Sandino, Augusto Cesar Sandino, in 1928. The repression exercised by the Leguía government in Peru is a reminder of one of the push factors involved in this ingathering of radicals, this inpouring of the disaffected in Mexico, and especially Mexico City. Some exiles and refugees were certainly semi-voluntary in nature, but there were plenty of examples of involuntary movements as well. The most important sources of exiles produced by repressive governments, in fact, though, were further north of Peru. They were in Venezuela and in Cuba. A group of daring young Venezuelan freedom fighters, many of them students, exiled after their involvement in struggles against the bloody dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gómez, who was dictatorial figure in Venezuela between 1908 and 1935. These young students made their way to Mexico sometimes after intermediate stops in Central America or Cuba. And there is a very distinctive cartography or periodization of exile in Latin America that I and a group of others are becoming increasingly interested in. People just don't go randomly when they're deported. They follow particular routes. Those routes for you guys, they change over time. And obviously those routes open and close depending on changing political culture and other circumstances. So we do need cartography. 5 minutes, and I was totally wrong in my prediction that I would finish in 20 minutes here. This Venezuelan group of freedom fighters includes figures like Salvador La Plaza, Carlos Aponte, and the Machado brothers, Gustavo and his sibling Eduardo. They were not attracted by Mexico's culture of vanguardism. They saw the country rather as a temporary refuge. But for the young Venezuelans, the actuality of armed struggle in the still young revolutionary Mexican state, which was facing military revolts still in the 1920s, offered them unique opportunities to acquire arms, to undertake their struggles to liberate Venezuela, as well as the chance to enlist support from sympathetic Mexican military officers and high political officials who actually supported struggles against dictatorial and reactionary regimes in the 1920s. And there were lots of those high officials and army officers. We need to know a great deal more about those. The Venezuelans embraced armed struggle in Venezuela and later in Cuba, giving a 20th century inflection to a much older Garibaldian tradition of heroic armed action. If I had time, I would be talking about some of the other tributaries here, Cuban ones, Julio Antonio Mella and the anti-Machado struggles, the arrival in Mexico of Sandino, along with a number of other Nicaraguans. By early 1928, Mexico City had become one of the nerve centers of the Sandinista campaign, a center from which Central American and South American activists traveled to join Sandino, and the most important source of financial and political support for the Sandino movement. Mexico City, therefore, was not accidentally a major hub of exiled revolutionaries in the 1920s who were bound together by membership in common networks of politics and sociability, and which created a new geography of resistance and agitation in downtown Mexico City. There were some important inner city hubs in this new map. They included, for example, the offices of organizations, magazines, and newspapers that supported exile plans and disseminated them in their press. And these locations included the offices of the newspaper of the Mexican Communist Party, El Machete, the Communist Party headquarters itself, which was in Calle Mesones. There were magazines galore that were at the heart of this new political dreaming and agitation. The most interesting then perhaps is a magazine called El Libertador, the organ of the Anti-Imperialist League of the Americas, which began to circulate in Mexico in early 1925, and whose pages chronicled popular struggles throughout the Americas. The choice of this title, El Libertador, for a paper was obviously very, very telling. I mean, clearly echoes of Bolivar are constantly present here. And indeed, the history of magazines and newspapers and their circulation and the networks in which they are involved is a very, very important part of this whole drama. For these insurgent intellectuals who sometimes have been referred to as sort of deracinated mobile identities, a sort of militant traveling culture that we need to be able to reconstruct. And here I'm going to sort of end by just referring to another geographical sort of metaphor here. I'm increasingly impressed by the need to look at geography, including mapping, and try and map things that traditionally have not been mapped. There is a new cartography of resistance in Mexico City which revolved around more than the politics of publication and public gathering. Many of the young men and women I've already mentioned, the Venezuelans, Meyer, several Peruvian revolutionaries, they came to share a house in central Mexico City that they soon discovered had historical associations with the life, very conveniently, with the life of the liberator, Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar, once again. Interesting how the Bolivarian myth featured so strongly in this period in the imaginaries of what, after all, were mostly socialist and Marxist figures. And I'll just finish with a quotation here. Chance allowed these exiles to sacralize one of the settings in the utopia which they'd chosen as their country of residence. It happened that in Mexico City they discovered a large old colonial house where Simón Bolívar, the liberator, had lived for a short while and which bore the name of the hero. The impact of this discovery was enormous for the Venezuelan exiles, who, according to Eduardo Machado in his biography, decided to move to the home together with exiles from other countries, thereby Latin Americanizing Bolivar's home in the middle of the 1920s. You can actually see that house too if you go not too far from the presidential palace. So I have to stop there, so I've run out of time, but I think these episodes, which can be repeated in different ways in later decades, does, I think, validate the importance of the transnational turn. It does involve us, I think, in locating Mexico much more clearly within the Americas than so far has been the case. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barry. And now, Manuel Chinchilla. Manuel obtained his BA in Spanish and a minor in Italian from Louisiana State University in 2002 and a PhD in Latin American literature from the University of Michigan in 2009. He's currently an assistant professor at the University of the South. His field of research is Latin American literature and politics, with a focus on the relationship between narrative genres, militancy, and interpretation of history. And I think it's very interesting that we have Manuel here with us today to hear what the new voices have to say about whether there is a link, we can say that there's a link of our relationship between the revolution and new democratic movements in Mexico.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the symposium organizers, of course, for inviting me, and thanks to Professor Del Valle, who's been the best hostess one can have at this beautiful Berkeley campus. To preface my essay, I just wish to say that it's, what I'm trying to do is to engage history through textuality, so it is, my talk adheres to a brand of Latin Americanism rooted in literary studies, and hence I use Ángel Rama's concept of the letter city. The Zapatista rebellion that erupted in the state of Chiapas on January 1st, 1994, has made writing an intricate part of its political strategy and a means for direct and constant communication with civil society. Such writing, in the form of communiqué, stories, and open letters, desires and fosters a politics of solidarity towards the movement, whose survival depends partly on its visibility vis-a-vis national and international audiences. The modes and channels through which this movement communicates, particularly its use of the internet and theatricality or performance, have made it possible for it to be depicted as the first postmodern revolution, one that seems to recycle the past while investing it with the technology and simulacra of the present. If one recalls Frederick Jameson's now well-known essay, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, the defining characteristic of postmodernism as a style is that of the emergence, and I quote, of a new kind of flatness or depthlessness, a new superficiality. Jameson exemplifies this emergence by comparing Andy Warhol's series of paintings titled Diamond Shoes, which evinces for the critic the shallowness of a postmodern style, and then Van Gogh's Peasant Shoes, where the work of art recalls human life and activity while linking it to utopia, and I quote, an act of will transformed into the stridency of utopian color. When confronting the many styles informing Zapatista writing, the reader immerses herself in both registers of the modern-postmodern divide, reading in the midst of representation and its utopian drive. However, this report has more to do with the content and arrangement of history performed in such writing than with the aforementioned paradigmatic medium of virtual communication or a hermeneutics of real history as it is supplanted by a history of aesthetic styles, which again would constitute the trademark of postmodernism. My aim in this short presentation is to read closely the periodizing of history, and a particular rebellious one, enacted by Zapatismo in order to produce not a fulfillment of history, but its opening onto the present as utopian time and landscape. The literary deployment of utopian projects in Latin America, such as the one undertaken by the Zapatistas, can be thought about through Ángel Rama's concept of the letter city. In this sense, I will examine Zapatista writing from a double register, at once a recounting of histories of insurrection and radical politics, and part of a conceptual history of Latin American writing in its relationship to power. Rama begins his essay by positing a twofold dimension of order and utopia. The letter city is the product of a colonial imagination that needs to represent social strata through the layers of its urban landscape, while infusing such design with a utopian drive for an ideal future. In this scheme, the Latin American landscape served as tabula rasa upon which imperial desire could graft its rational designs and bring about a new civilization. And here are some of my quotes were in Spanish, so I'll translate in real time, so bear with my English. Instead of representing the actual thing through signs, these signs were in charge of representing the dream of the thing. This is Rama, right? So ardently desired in this time of utopias, opening the way to a future that would govern modern times and reach an apotheosis almost delirious in contemporaneity. The dream of an order would work in order to perpetuate and preserve power. The dream of this symbolic city takes several incarnations as it is anchored in Rama's thought by a particular group of intellectuals who are given the task of designing and promulgating the ideal order and the desires it seeks to project. Attached to a metropolitan center of power that changes its scope according to the historical necessities of a state administration, from the colonial viceroyalty that orders conquered territories to its later versions in Baroque society, modernity, and revolution, the letter city is the constant tool required for maintaining or changing the power relationships organizing the Latin American landscape. For Rama, it is an intellectual practice drastically centered on an urban setting, which is, and I quote, its natural habitat and its inextricable substance. Mexico figures prominently in Rama's design as it charts two important beginnings. First, as seed to the viceroyalty of New Spain, and later as the break that in 1911 ignited a revolutionary era that would traverse the entire continent. Interestingly enough, Rama chooses to introduce the Mexican Revolution by making reference to Porfirian celebrations commemorating the first centenary of Mexican independence. The description of a commemoration suddenly disturbed by insurgency is followed by Rama's assessment of the revolution's aftermath, as the work of intellectuals belonging to the letter city was rerouted toward the PRI's subsequent drive for institutionalization. By framing the Mexican experience of revolution as moving from commemorative fulfillment to disruption, and then again to institutionalization, Rama's quotes produce a meta frame for the celebration of Mexico's twin anniversary of independence and revolution. Reading Rama's thoughts after the Mexican government's lavish commemoration of such historical events under the guise of accomplished facts, and the fact that the PRI, the once political party in charge of a continuous national revolutionary process, finds itself out of power, can only make us question even further the relationship between incomplete revolutionary processes and the deployment of conciliatory discourses by the state. In this sense, Zapatista writing may occupy a vantage point over the history of Mexican insurgency and civil disagreement as a still ongoing rebellion seeking to make sense from the past unfinished business while also trying to create a new utopian order. One way of inferring the unique perspective afforded by Zapatismo over Mexican unrest is to acknowledge its rapport with the latter city and to analyze its adherence to previous social and political movements. And here we can return briefly to the end of Rama's unfinished book. Rama finishes his book by going back to the Mexican Revolution and to the literature of the Mexican Revolution. He finishes the book commenting on, as well as los de abajo, the underdogs. And what he describes is an intellectual triangle where Demetrio Macias, who is the revolutionary protagonist, is beset by different types of intellectuals. And so there's Alberto Solis, who is the revolution's regretful witness, the insane Valderrama, who has gone crazy because of the war, and Luis Cervantes, who is the opportunistic secretary who sacrifices the revolution's ideals, and in a way also his partners during the war so that he can get ahead, right? And he would, I guess, symbolize most closely this institutional drive or this engagement of intellectuals outside of the revolution once the war or the conflict ends. The novel can also be seen to be redirecting the latter city towards the horizon of state politics, since the last image of Demetrio is literally a monument to the revolutionary who is petrified and sanctified in the perpetual gesture of its fighting, and I quote, "At the foot of a hollow, sumptuous and huge as the portico of an old cathedral, Demetrio Macias, his eyes leveled in an eternal glance, continues to point the barrel of his gun." And this is the final image, so it's a monument to the revolutionary, no longer an active figure. In a similar manner, Zapatismo has found itself caught between leftist intellectuals and the possibility of its absorption by the political system, particularly during the context of the 2006 national elections, when the PRD was acknowledged as a viable guarantor of leftist politics. And of course, the Zapatista refused to support the PRD and instead began the insanity, or what some people think of an insanity, of the other campaign, La Otra Campaña. Thus, we can observe in the short history of Zapatismo's rebellion two stages of rapport between the movement and the latter city. First, a coming together of intellectuals, especially those belonging to the metropolitan lettered elite, and then a rupture by which the Zapatistas performed their own utopian project. In her article entitled "Making History, Subcomandante Marcos in the Mexican Chronicle," Beth Jorgensen investigates the writing of four Mexico City chroniclers, Alma Guillermo Prieto, Juan Villoro, Elena Poniatowska, y Carlos Monsiváis, as they traveled to the country's periphery in order to test the Zapatistas' political and discursive strategies. Her essay centers on the use of theatricality and performance by the Subcomandante Marcos and the intellectuals' reaction to it. But in a subtle manner, Jorgensen's essay attests to the search for a new political discourse stemming from the outskirts of the latter city, one that must also be carried back to the metropolitan center. This is ever more poignant in the writing of Poniatowska and Monsiváis, important figures of the Mexican urban chronicles, and authors of books that compile the history of civil disagreement born out of the '68 student movement and the civil response that followed after the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. Their chronicles on Chiapas and its rebellion produce a reversal of the urban setting displayed by the latter city envisioned by Rama, performing a shift in the paradigm whereby Zapatista discourse becomes the purveyor of a new political project. Furthermore, Zapatista writing itself enacts a shift from metropolitan culture to Chiapas as it creates its own chronicles in order to periodize political struggle on a national frame. In performing the chronicle of its own movement, Zapatista writing encompasses the revolution of 1910, the civil unrest of the 60s, and the 80s drive to democracy. The way in which such periodization takes place is tied to a retroactive historical stance, one where the present opens itself up to the bringing forth of previous moments of unrest. So here it's not just a matter of quoting, but the way in which this quoting is done, which is simply not a bringing back or a remembrance, but literally sort of opening a hole in time whereby present and past communicate. And now I can find where I stopped. Such operation occurs through a commemorative register that nonetheless avoids the freezing of such events. They're becoming monuments or reified icons of institutional politics, aiming instead for their active engagement with the present. In fact, Zapatista writing has confronted, from its beginnings, two possible and opposite political histories of the Mexican nation. On the one hand, a continuous history of injustice that remains constant from the colonial period through Porfirian dictatorship and on to contemporary times. This is evident in the movement's first communiqué, where Chiapas Governor Gonzalo Garrido is compared to a viceroy and the state he governs to an anachronistic Porfirian hacienda. On the other side of the spectrum, there are no state embodiments of power, but periods of political theory and practice where a project for a different Mexico was and can still be glimpsed. On September 19, 1996, the Zapatistas published a communiqué where they commemorate the 11th anniversary of the Mexico City earthquake. Specifically, the actions of the citizenry as they took power into their own hands when the government seemed incapable of controlling the effects of the catastrophe. The communiqué makes clear that such civil actions fall within a space that exists outside state power or official narratives, and I quote, "There are no historical monuments nor governmental tributes for all those men and women that expropriated heroism from its unreachable place," end quote. The communiqué goes on to explain how such actions created a contention between citizenry and state, allowing for the existence of two competing political projects, one based on state sovereignty and an alternative one informed by civilian dissent and power. A similar narrative and political interpretation is performed when commemorating the 68 student movement in a communiqué dated October 2nd, 1998. 30 years after the state-sponsored massacre that provoked the movement's decline. But the communiqué's aim is not merely to remember the fallen comrades, but to open the present to the political possibilities envisioned by the students. I quote again, "68 is a window to see and learn about the open confrontation between different ways of doing politics." This type of commemorative register is taken to an extreme in a message given by the EZLN to inaugurate the intercontinental encounter for humanity and against neoliberalism. Hosted this time in a different utopian landscape than Rama's latter city, in the Zapatista territories named La Realidad. The message, titled "Today, 85 years later, history repeats itself," is issued on April 4th, 1996, and recounts a series of events in relationship to Zapatismo's present struggle. Thus, it remembers the writing of the brothers Magón, taking place in 1911, 85 years before the Zapatista encounter, the fight of Emiliano Zapata in 1916, 80 years before, and finally, the writing of the Bolivian diaries of Che Guevara in 1966, 30 years before the event, and his assassination 29 years before, or actually this is backwards, in 1967. It's 30 and 29. A salient feature of this enumeration of events and dates is their asymmetry with the usual commemorative organization of time. Instead of fixed decades, 50-year anniversaries, or centennials, some of these dates don't fit into this usual periodization. So the remembrance, it's made with regards to a time not measured in its passing, but in its validity and value to a present moment. The recounting is performed in order to demonstrate that an ongoing moment of insurrection occurring in Chiapas is part of a genealogy of struggles, each one attempting to produce an alternative political project, each one a moment that can fit the present and its possible futures. The dichotomy between events and their protagonists as either living present experiences or petrified icons is exemplified by the text's treatment of Guevara's memory. And I quote, "For some it is dead, for others it is asleep. Who's wrong? 30 years ago, El Che was preparing the transformation of the American reality, la realidad americana, and power was preparing its destruction. 29 years ago, power said that history had ended. They said that the possibility of a different reality, a better one, had been destroyed." And I close quote. The passage describes an ambivalent feeling toward the figure of Guevara. For some, it is a dead project, for others, a latent utopia. But the way in which the reader confronts the quote is through an affiliation with Zapatista's struggle as an ongoing present that communicates with said utopian drive. This becomes evident if the reader pays close attention to the text and realizes that la realidad, that reality that Guevara wanted to transform, is written in capital letters, making it a noun and therefore assimilating it with the Zapatistas' utopian landscape. In this way, Zapatismo is actively linked to the Guevaran ideal as it grafts itself textually upon its design. In his ethnographic work on the reception and transformation of Zapatismo by North American activists, Alex Kasnavich has compiled a series of interviews where the main question is why a movement like Zapatismo has had such an impact beyond its country of origin. The answer lied not only in Zapatismo's identification of neoliberalism as global enemy, or the virtual velocity of its communiques as they traveled through cyberspace, but more importantly on the reinscription of political activism within a constellation of struggles. Rick Valle, one of the activists interviewed, expressed it. The Zapatistas, and I quote, were a tear in the fabric of the present. They were a crack through which it was possible for people to remember histories of struggle that they'd been taught to forget. This capacity to create utopian landscapes and histories enacted by Zapatista writing makes use of the chronicle and commemorative registers in order to open a channel between past and present struggles, ordering them within the utopia of a future that engages liberation as part of direct democracy and autonomous governments. And to end, I just want to say that what the other campaign was trying to do and is still trying to do is to create precisely a network of autonomous local projects outside of the letter city and, of course, outside of representative politics. And do I still have like 2 minutes? And the other thing is I was just rereading, because I'm trying to be a hardcore communist too, or Marxist, Frederick Jameson periodizing the 60s, and he has this very perceptive read on Foucault's strategy in the Cuban Revolution. And what he says is that not only it's a third space in the sense that it's neither city or countryside, but that it is a third space because it's a space that it's creating a revolutionary subjectivity that cannot exist in either of the two places, but it doesn't exclude either place. And so that's why I think that although it's good and feasible to compare Zapatista writing to the literature of the Mexican Revolution, to see its relationship to Mexican state politics, in another sense, I think that this literature belongs to a lineage of writing that has more to do with Central American guerrilla and testimonial writing and on the Central American insurrections and the Cuban Revolution, because it is in that literature that this coming subjectivity is confronted. So books like Days of the Jungle by Payeras, the poetry of Roque Dalton, any of the diaries and political essays by Guevara, and even Jose Marti's diaries will be more in place to look at how Zapatista writing works and functions. Thank you.
Gracias, Manuel. And now, Gareth Williams. Gareth Williams is Associate Professor of Spanish and Latin American and Caribbean Studies in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at the University of Michigan. And since the publication of his book, The Other Side of the Popular, Neoliberalism and Subalternity in Latin America, he has been one of the leading voices defining the field of Latin American 20th century literature. This book will also be published in Chile, Hacia el Otro Lado de lo Popular, Neoliberalismo y Subalternidad en América Latina. He has published numerous articles on the relation between Latin American literature, film, and political philosophy, and has given over 40 professional presentations of his work in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. His second book, titled The Mexican Exception, Sovereignty, Police, Democracy, is forthcoming at Palgrave Macmillan. And Gareth is also one of the founder members of the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group. So, Gareth.
Thank you very, very much, Ivonne. Thank you to all the organizers, and thank you for being here today. My talk today is essentially about the fine relationship between saying and doing, which came up in the conversation this morning. And it's about that relationship around the figure of the guerrilleros, in particular the guerrilla of the Partido de los Pobres from 1967 to 1974. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm going to be doing a reading of Carlos Montemayor's La Guerra en el Paraíso, which stages a disagreement between Lucio Cabañas and the governor of Guerrero. And that this disagreement is a particular staging of the political. So I'll just get into it. What's at stake ultimately is, in this conversation, in this disagreement between these two figures, what's ultimately at stake is the notion of freedom and the question of gestures towards the freedom of all. So here we go. If we consider that it is the opening up of a breach, of an interruption in politics' relation to regulation, or a zone of immeasurability in the order of police calculation that allows for the experience and figuration of freedom, then we can say that the Party of the Poor insisted absolutely on its claims to freedom. Indeed, it was a decisive leap, the audacious staging of an incommensurable claim to freedom, and to freedom as the opening up of incalculability, that really hit the nerve of sovereign power. This came to the fore in late May 1974, with Lucio Cabañas' interview and subsequent kidnapping of the pre-candidate for state governorship, Rubén Figueroa. In hindsight, this episode constituted the political and military error that cost the brigade, the Peasant Justice Brigade, which is the armed wing of the Partido de los Pobres. It was this that cost the brigade its complete annihilation. For the kidnapping unleashed the most brutal period in the war between parties. It led to the military saturation of the highlands, the complete isolation of the whole region, together with the torture and disappearance of entire populations. But the fate of Rubén Figueroa had little to do with this. Rather, it was the party's staging of a demand for absolute freedom for the part of those who have no part, that produced the sovereign decision for absolute annihilation. In the same way the state had amnestied Rubén Jaramillo repeatedly before finally getting rid of him in 1962, Rubén Figueroa proposed negotiating with and thereby co-opting Lucio Cabañas as a means of bringing him back into the fold of the revolutionary family. In June 1974, and as a reply to increased military repression in the region, Cabañas extended a secret invitation to Figueroa to meet and talk with him in the Atoyac Highland. But instead of entering into negotiations with the state, the Peasant Justice Brigade detained Figueroa and held him for ransom. However, they did not ransom him just for money. They did so for the freedom of all. Carlos Montemayor's Guerra en el Paraíso, clearly it's a fiction, but it's one of the most historical fictions that I come across. Carlos Montemayor's Guerra en el Paraíso stages this encounter between the two men as a lengthy disagreement over the meaning of the word freedom. So what I'd like to do now is just present the basic tenets of this disagreement between these two figures. The translation is all mine. It's lengthy, so be patient. You've spent 7 years in the mountains, said Rubén Figueroa, with fatigue in his voice. But what can fighting against the army, the government, and the people like me who haven't done anything against you possibly bring you? Lucio responds, well, the problem we're discussing is freedom for all prisoners. All the other problems can be solved on a state-by-state basis, as you say. But the question of the prisoners is another problem, because it's not just a state problem. I told you, I'll try to free your brother, insisted Rubén Figueroa. I'll ask the president as a personal favor to me. Rest assured it'll be taken care of by June 23rd. Within a week, you'll receive news I've talked to your brother. Cabañas responds, but we don't see any particular state or geographical problems. We see a national problem. I agree it's national, but I can only respond for Guerrero, replied Rubén Figueroa. What do I get with my uncle, my brother, says Cabañas. We don't have any agreement about that. We've been working things over and we haven't reached a resolution yet. So we're going to make another proposition. We've agreed that you'll come with us until the prisoners are free. We want you to accompany us until they free the prisoners, but not like in a kidnap. You're not kidnapped here. What? It's the brigade's military agreement on behalf of the prisoners. You're not kidnapped. You're detained. We're not threatening you with your life like kidnappers do. Didn't I free your uncles Bertoldo and Luis? And I know your cousin Manuel and another uncle are prisoners. I promise to try my best. Cabañas says, and what's the good of 1 or 2 freed prisoners? The governor responds, they say a hen fills her beak grain by grain. Cabañas responds, and what about over there, over yonder, all those people in Acapulco, Chilpancingo, Chiapas, Aguascalientes, Sonora, Chihuahua, Monterrey, Guadalajara, the Acatitlo women, all of them completely innocent, and we want them out. That's what the brigade wants. I told you, this problem doesn't fit in writing, and that we shouldn't deal with it because we weren't going to solve it, but I brought it up with you anyway. I'll tell you clearly, says Figueroa, the president does not have the authority to do this, and since he doesn't have the authority, you might as well have me shot. We'll see, says Cabañas. The disagreement continues. Cabañas comes back to talk to Figueroa, and he says, we want to free people. Fine, Lucio, fine, conceded Figueroa in irritation. Then there's another question, says Cabañas. Someone who's been kidnapped has no right to speak or vote or communicate with anyone else or to see other people's faces, and on top of that, they're threatened with death. But you talk. We are conversing. You are saying what you think, and I'm not putting my hand over your mouth, and nobody's hitting you, so you'll say what we want you to say, like the government you belong to does. Kidnapped people can't see their captors, and you can see us. You're here on a visit, and in that way, you're going to help the revolution in spite of yourself, so they hand over the prisoners. But let's be clear. I'm not treating you the way the government treats people when they're detained by the army or the judicial police. End of quote. This is not an encounter between two absolutely incommunicable languages or incommensurable forms of life. Rather, the senator and the guerrilla leader understand each other's speech as a struggle over the meaning of freedom in its relation to sovereign command and justice. Freedom for Rubén Figueroa signifies the sole empire of the laws of private oligarchic interest. It is gained as a result of specific individual negotiations and personal favors in a regime of power that is sanctioned by the authority of presidential jurisdiction reigning over an empire of individual interests. It is also the space beyond the mountains of Guerrero, where those individual negotiations, personal favors, and unhurried administrative measures occur. They say a hen fills her beak grain by grain. Freedom for Lucio Cabañas is the struggle against the privatization of general interest. For the guerrilla leader, Figueroa's notion of freedom implies systematic and historical injustice, detention, imprisonment without trial, torture, abuse, isolation, and enforced silence. Lucio says his idea of freedom does not fit in writing. He recognizes it cannot be captured and therefore represented by law or administrative calculations. For Lucio, freedom is the expression of general interest, which includes the right of all to be counted as a speaking being. He says to Figueroa, but you talk, we are conversing, you are saying what you think, and I'm not putting my hand over your mouth, and nobody's hitting you, so you'll say what we want you to say. Freedom means to be free from harm and danger, to be safeguarded from the violence of sovereign force. In this sense, for Lucio, freedom means to be at peace and to be allowed to remain in peace. It's the expression of the right to language, license, liberty, self-determination, and free will. And his gesture toward the liberation of countless prisoners, toward the freedom of all, is a democratic gesture that exposes the incommensurable relation between the private play of the oligarchs and freedom. His demand for the liberty of all prisoners stages the contradiction between the specific counts of administrative logic and the political logic that works in the name of a whole that remains beyond all counts, beyond all measure. It makes me think of Adolfo Gilli's phrase from this morning, an injury to one is an injury to all. Administration cannot calculate that away. That's the problem. His gesture proposes throwing out the difference in the count between who is in and who is outside the community of the free, thereby assuming that those who do not count, the peasantry of Guerrero, actually assume that their group is identical to the whole of the free community. When the party's demands are made public, they cannot be tolerated by the state because Lucio's ransom stages the indeterminacy that grounds the relation between authority and freedom. He presents the state with a gesture for the freedom of all, the potential consequences of which remain beyond reasonable measure and calculation. This section is called Absolute Hostility and the New Sovereign. The state ridicules the party of the poor as ignorant, absurd, and unacceptable. And the state responds to the heterogeneous assumptions of the part of those who have no part by stepping outside the realm of legality. What is extraordinary is that for the first time in post-revolutionary Mexico, we see that the traditional right of sovereign power, the right to decide over life and death, and it clearly in the Hobbesian notion of sovereign power, it's fear that makes people or that allows people to recognize the authority of the mortal God of the sovereign. What is extraordinary at this point is that we see that the traditional right of sovereign power to decide over life and death is supplemented by the installation of a new system of rule that includes but also surpasses the traditional concept of sovereign force. The war against the party of the poor is the active forging of a zone of lawlessness that makes the effective regulation and preemptive modernization of the rural world possible. Within this zone, killing and torture become coterminous with the production and reproduction of life itself, as something as harmless as road construction becomes predicated on the sovereign right to decide to kill or let live. The novel presents a series of presentations by the military. As General Solano Chagoya assures his military staff, he says, "Remember this, gentlemen," he said, looking at some enlarged areas of the map that lay among other papers on the table. The routes we're opening up throughout the zone are for our benefit, not for the guerrilla. The roads and communications we've opened up are for our security, not for theirs. We still cannot aspire to the perfection of this infrastructure, but it has to be in our benefit. Later, when we finish with the last remnants of all violence, all the communications will be perfect, and you'll be able to vacation around here on your bicycle if you want, but not right now." End of quote. Elsewhere, a journalist asks the governor of Guerrero, "Is there any relation between the guerrilla and the construction work being carried out in the Atoyac Islands? Can they be considered to be a government response?" End of quote. In his reply, Socio-economic development and institution building are a multi-layered reaction to the political figure and threat of the guerrillero. He says, these actions in the highlands represent the union of various wills. The coming together of these wills has led to the construction of roads, schools, medical centres, Conasupo, food and supply stores, credit for coffee growers and coconut harvesters, plus the telephone lines that will run from village to village throughout the Atoyac region. Actions of such vast proportions requiring such enormous federal, state and local investment cannot be carried out overnight. They cannot be improvised as a result of the demands of clandestine anti-social groups such as Lucio Cabañas. The agrarian struggle for justice is rendered backward and anti-social, as capital time is installed and the calculations of military annihilation are made coextensive with a whole productive anatomy of social power that blurs the distinction between sovereign force and everyday life. It was in Mexico's Cold War, mini-Vietnam, in the armed struggle between the Institutional Revolutionary Party and the Party of the Poor, that we encounter the new relation between the traditional sovereign right to kill or let live and the modern right to forge a community that exists as a specific, territorialized, and fully regulated population. Foucault called this biopolitics. In the guerrilla of the 1970s, the absolute hostility of a war of annihilation between parties cannot be distinguished from the state's calculation and regularization of collective welfare. Participants in a struggle to the death, citizens are provided the services of the modern biopolitical ratio, such as the construction of schools, health benefits, roads, social security, medical facilities, as well as electricity, water, and communication networks. In 1969, 2 battalions of soldiers arrived in Guerrero, and they brought 500 military doctors who distributed aid, medicines, and food to the people of Coyuca, San Jerónimo, Atoyac, and Tecpan. In 1971 and 72, a socio-economic study was carried out with a view to future development plans. In 1972, the Integral State Development Plan for Guerrero was announced. Between 1971 and 1974, over 200 kilometers of newly paved highways were constructed. In the context of the peasant insurgency of that time, killing and torture, as I said, became coterminous with infrastructure building and the saving of lives via modern medical techniques. Naked sovereign power and the militarized immunization of the social sphere became part and parcel of the same class war, as the Mexican reason of state split into the workings of sovereign obliteration and the protection of the population simultaneously. Killing and collective welfare became indifferent to each other, as they each became the alibi of the other in exactly the same instant. And all of this was mobilized in such a way as to resist the return of the ghost, to repress or exorcise the returning spectre of Emiliano Zapata, but in a war that could no longer be like that of the ghost, because now it was part and parcel of Cold War low-intensity tactics. By the end of the novel, the new sovereign subject of history is the military, and its enemy is a cultural geography that can still believe in the ghosts of the agrarian past. The generals are very clear about their new position in the relation between the sovereign right to kill and the right to regularize entire territories and populations. General Escárcega explains most clearly the sovereign decisionism of his increasingly autonomous military corporation. And I quote, "For the first time," this is a general speaking, "for the first time in modern Mexico, there is a total military occupation of a whole region. It's not easy for many to comprehend, not even for the army. It is an experience of historical proportions. We can say we're fighting against a handful of young men or Indians or communists, but the truth is we're controlling entire towns, municipalities, cities, mountains, communications, everything. The enemy is in all the villages and not just in the group of guerrillas. That's why it's a question of confronting the people themselves. That's why we have total control of the region, gentlemen, because it cannot be resolved in any other way. And only a force such as the army can take a decision such as that. I'm thinking," he continues, "I'm thinking that throughout this century, the whole zone has been Zapatista. Zapatista guerrillas were strong not just in Morelos, in Cuautla, but in Guerrero, in the very region belonging to Lucio. And let's not forget that Zapatismo never developed the powerful regular army like Villismo did. Zapatismo was always a kind of fiction in military terms. It hid in towns, it blended in, then suddenly jumped out at some point and disappeared again. It was above all a guerrilla force rather than a regular army. End of quote. For the newly independent and increasingly sovereign military, the war against Lucio Cabañas and the Party of the Poor is a war against the return of the ghost of Emiliano Zapata. The enemy is history, geography, and the people who inhabit it, that is, the legacy and territory of Zapata. Within this radical militarization of the civilian state, Zapatista claims for the just distribution of public wealth, as defined in Article 27 of the 1917 Constitution, are, by definition, declarations of absolute enmity. And in order to combat such claims, sovereign decisionism becomes a ubiquitous tool in the arsenal of an absolute military hostility, capable of availing itself of the preemptive modernization and regularization of the cultural geography, its institutions, and its communication networks. State enmity toward the ghost of Zapata is biopoliticized and militarized. Enmity is situated at the heart of the relation between intelligence and security and is applied to anyone in a given territory in a preemptive, low-intensity war against the part of those who have no part. The enemy is no longer just he or she who declares themselves to be an enemy of the state by taking up arms in the name of general interest. The notion of enemy now includes a component of potentiality based on previous intelligence. The enemy is now the probable enemy, no longer merely the certain enemy. In other words, speculation, preemptive speculation. The probable enemy, in other words, is now the population of a rural area with an established or just a potential relation to the ghost. I'll finish. On June 28, 1995, a pickup truck carrying a few dozen peasants, several of them members of the peasant organization of the Southern Highlands, were traveling to Atoyac in the Costa Grande of Guerrero. They were en route to the birthplace of Lucio Cabañas to protest the disappearance of Gilberto Romero Vázquez, an activist who had not been seen in the area for a month. At approximately 10:30 in a place called Paso Real, the pickup truck was brought to a halt by hundreds of uniformed officers of the Guerrero State Motorized Police, the judicial police, as well as ununiformed armed men who'd been lying in wait for the pickup truck for up to 5 hours. The security forces were armed with R-15 machine guns, AK-47s, shotguns, and pistols. The peasants were ordered down from the pickup truck. When one of them resisted having his machete taken away, shots rang out. The order was immediately given to round up and kill the whole group. The official version is that 17 were killed and 20 injured. Other versions talk of summary executions of the wounded and the presence of 2 helicopters to transport and dispose of cadavers elsewhere in order to reduce the official numbers of the massacred. There's a lot of speculation here. Weapons were placed in the hands of the dead peasants, and the security forces were immediately claimed to have acted in self-defense. However, state police shot a video of the massacre that was later leaked to national television. Nobody, not even Guerrero State Governor Rubén Figueroa, the son of Rubén Figueroa, has been held responsible for the massacre. And I think that in the relationship between these names, we have the idea, the Benjaminian idea that came up this morning in Gilly's work of the homogeneous time of capital. Rubén Figueroa gives way to Rubén Figueroa. The peasants killed in the Aguas Blancas massacre of 1995 were not the real enemy. They were the potential enemy, and the price they paid was the price of probability. If they had arrived in Atoyac, they might have caused trouble, but they didn't. The use of prior intelligence and the de facto state of exception in Guerrero took care of that before anything serious could happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. So now, if you have questions, please. Okay, here. It's right here, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I have one general question for all of you, and I have one kind of specific question for Professor Williams. But I'll start with the more general one. In terms of Professor Carr was mentioning the geography of how dissidents from, I presume, mostly European descent came to the Americas and kind of spread the ideas of the left, so to speak. Currently, there is, from my understanding, there is this internal struggle within the left, not just here in the United States, but also in Mexico and Latin America, of trying to define kind of like, is it a class struggle that we want to fight first, or is it a decolonial struggle that we must point out? My question is, given the geography and the distribution that is so extensive from the south of the United States all the way to Buenos Aires, what sort of modes of communication can be possibly established to create a dialogue, a regional dialogue of not just north to south, but east to west, and also a very much an indigenous dialogue where we see Europe not just expanding, but arriving from the point of view of an indigenous, for instance, a female indigenous, that sees not just capital from a male perspective expanding, but all these gender roles and racial hierarchies put in place. So on the geographical question, if Professor Carr could maybe comment on that, and on the other, Professor Williams, maybe on the expansion and the arrival, and also on the perspective of a decolonial possibility first in relation to a revolutionary change.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I assume the focus of your question is really on more contemporary issues. I mean, the challenges you talked about. I mean, there's no question, I think, but that the networks that I began talking about from the 1920s, but the same thing could be said for the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and probably even closer to today. These are print culture networks. So you asked a question about what are the modes of communication used then and how might they be expanded to include more open mechanisms and modes. You say that might incorporate the indigenous, lo indígena, indigenous people and indigenous forms of communication. Well, the first part of that is that until now, the networks that I've been talking about are absolutely limited to fairly literate peoples. They involve print culture, which is essentially 19th century in character, although by the teens, 20s, and 30s already it's possible to produce magazines, newspapers, flyers, and other agitational material at very, very low prices, and it's the audience for those communications means begins to change. It begins to be expanded quite substantially. There's a democratization of access to this kind of media. But it's still largely a literate media, although there were mechanisms which were employed which did directly address the needs of people who were barely literate. I mean, in the case of Mexico, of course, all kinds of techniques used which involved open air art, newspapers that could be posted on walls, the whole history of muralism. In part, it's obviously a complex history, but in part it's about sort of making it possible for narratives to be understood and to be dialogue with people with limited literacy. And if I was to put my Cuban my Cuban scholar hat on. Of course, there's a rich history of communication involving semi-literate, in some cases illiterate, workers in the tobacco industry. The famous institution of the lector and the lecturas, which are part of tobacco work from the 1870s onwards, well into the period of the Cuban Revolution, although towards the end you get obviously more literacy. The issue of where indigenous people come into the story is a very interesting one. It's also one I think that leaves me rather pessimistic, because I think this point was raised yesterday by Emilio, and when he was talking about the limits of indigenismo in the 20s and 30s. Indigenismo is a discourse of essentially urban and to some degree rural intellectuals. It's about what people of the cities and of the lettered city are saying and talking about, rather than about the lived experience of indigenous people themselves. So as far as I'm aware, although the indigenous problem becomes more and more at the center of Latin American radicalism as you get to the end of the 1920s, it emerges for the first time with people like Mariátegui in particular. It's still the debate is a debate which is very much limited by print culture, and it's a debate pretty much limited to people who speak on behalf of indigenous people rather than of indigenous people themselves.
Let's see. In terms of, I think that I can address your questions maybe on two different levels. I'm not too sure. In terms of what appears to be, the question of the geography or the geographies, and the distinction that is easily made between Europe and the Americas, it makes me think of one figure who was very important to Zapata, which was the village teacher, Otilio Montaño, who introduced Zapata to the readings of Kropotkin on the Paris Commune. This dichotomy, this distinction, clear distinction between that which is European and that which is indigenous. I'm not too clear about that. I think history questions that quite actively. In terms of the idea of the decolonial possibility, I must admit that I don't know what that means. I know it's a word that is used a lot in the last 5 years or so, but I have to admit it's kind of meaningless to me, because I'm still far more interested in notions such as freedom, equality and democracy, which are the founding concepts of republicanism and democracy. So the decolonial thing, what can we call it, the defeudalization of societies? I really don't know. Do you have an understanding of the decolonial possibility?
Well, I just wanted to kind of know where more or less the three of you were in terms of this literature. And that's why I posted the question.
Sure.
With the decolonial kind of.
Sure.
But my personal limited knowledge of this literature that you pointed out is new, is that a lot of the questions or the discourses around revolutions are very much trapped still to this day, according to a decolonial language, in Eurocentric notions of human rights, of notions of state, notions of sovereignty, which are very much a project, whether it's from the right or from the left, but still situated within the canon of knowledge that's coming from Europe.
Yeah, sure. And there's no outside to that. The nation state is essentially a European history. That's what's inherited. And so for me, instead of, it's a little bit why I was talking about, not about los indígenas, but about the part of those who have no part. which is a way of getting out of that language of what's European and what's American. It's about the counts and how democratic societies count administratively those who are in and those who are not in. And so it has far more to do with the claims of democratic movements. And by doing that, of course, what I'm doing is I'm going back to Aristotle's politics, which is, I think, is something that we could all do, including the decolonialists.
Emilio.
A small question or maybe clarification from Professor Chinchilla. It's about terminology. So when you talk about Zapatista writings, I'm not sure how exactly you understand them. Let's put it this way. What is the difference between Zapatista writings and the writings of Marcos? Maybe you can elaborate on that. Are they the same? And if they're not, then why not call them the writing of Marcos? I'm not saying that they are, I just want to know how you... and if they are mainly or entirely or majoritarily the writings of Marcos, then how do you deal with that and the whole question of where you place him in regards to the lettered city? I mean, after all, you know, before he was what he is now, he was a professor. And so I just wondered how you think through that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't deal with it because I think it's not important. The political structure of the Zapatistas, of course, we can never go into the heart of La Realidad, right? We can never see exactly how it works. But he is always, even if it's a performance, but it is what it is, it's a subcomandante, he is a spokesperson, so he's speaking on behalf of the movement. And something that happens in Zapatista writing, which I didn't talk about, is that there is a mixture, of course, of the letter city. There is a whole rewriting of the Latin American boom, for example. Instructions on how to go up a tree, right? It's the famous, or not so famous, I guess, Cortázar's short story instructions, you know, to go up a ladder, to put on a pullover, etc. So, of course, there is a literary machine that comes from the letter city, right? But the idea here is that this machine, it's subverted. And one important thing about Zapatismo, in thinking too about this idea of decolonization or the decolonial, is that it performs all of these reversals of power, right? So the spokesperson is actually under obedience of the political base, and this is repeated on and on throughout the discourse. Whether or not one can, let's say, verify that factually, I don't know, but that is Zapatismo's claim. And then, in addition to that claim, and this has to do with the idea of maybe an indigenous point of view, or a female point of view, or a feminist, I'd rather put it like that, feminist point of view, Zapatismo always forbids a state politics. That is, Zapatismo never wants to be a blueprint for expanding ideological or political territory. So they always say this formula that we're using, it's good for Chiapas and our autonomous territories, but not for the rest. And that is a clear difference from the way the letter city works. The letter city has to expand its metropolitan project to the nation, and Zapatismo doesn't. Of course, this has all kinds of contradictions, right? One of the first things that Zapatismo had to fight the national media and the official national media was that they were not guerrillas from Guatemala. And so from the beginning, they wanted to be a national movement, but also an autonomous local one. And one thing I want to do when I eventually get to doing this research on Zapatismo has a literary genre is to look also at Mayan oral tradition and temporality in the writing, how time is fashioned as part of this oral tradition that is mixed too with products of the lettered city. So I think the answer lies in how this lettered city works, the politics it tries to perform. The other campaign, I think it's the perfect example, right? that's a political campaign that doesn't create consensus and a national project. In fact, it's destroying it. I don't know if that answers it.
If I may be allowed to intervene very briefly there, I'm not entirely convinced by the claims, for example, of mandar obedeciendo, for example, of Marcos. We know to some degree what the Ciudad Letrada, how it functions and how its various artifacts function. But really, you know, in spite of the vast explosion of writing about the new Zapatismo, we know very, very little about the structure and functioning and decision-making and other instances of the support communities. I mean, it's really very, very, very difficult, even in areas such as the emergence of policy on women, for example, which are to some degree being documented, and we do have the presence of indigenous Zapatista women speaking, so we have women's voices there. But overwhelmingly, I think we are in the presence of a radicalized university professor who has enormous capacity. I mean, talking about in terms of the discourse of the movement, who has extraordinary capacity to intersect both, I think, indigenous belief systems, and there were very strong presence there. I think he is addressing and speaking, sort of addressing some levels of indigenous, addressing indigenous mythology. But he's also speaking from the very, very beginning, I think, largely to urban layers, both within Mexico and elsewhere, who I think have responded, of course, very interestingly to him. So it's not a challenge there. I just think the claims being made about the nature of Zapatismo at the grassroots level, in terms of its peculiarly democratic and horizontal, et cetera, nature, I think have yet to be validated in terms of research. That's my sense.
I think that, yeah, one more question. Matt? There's time? Yeah, Matt. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Matt O'Hara, and my question's for Manuel, and I was interested in your ideas. I found them very intriguing for my own personal interests, obviously, and inclinations, the way you were discussing time and temporality. And my question has to do with your discussion of Zapatista writings and the kind of reaching into the past, not as commemoration, you said, not as memorialization, but as a kind of an empty time, an aporia where past is brought into the present for the lessons that it might have for now. And so my question has to do with, well, first, if you could explain that just a bit more, maybe elaborate on it, but also in your readings, what's the signal to you that that's the correct reading versus this might be a moment of commemoration, or something in between the two? So if you could speak to that a bit.
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that these times are not spoken as past actions, but as projects. So the student movement, and this is, I mean, if I had done a longer quote, but the student movement is very important because most of the literature on the student movement always places utmost importance on the massacre. So that the student movement, on October 2nd, there was a massacre that signaled the decline of the movement. The movement did not end with the massacre, and in fact, it went on a lower scale, a lesser scale, within the prisons, amongst the political prisoners who, in the eve of January 1968, New Year's Eve, performed a hunger strike, thinking that they could reorganize the movement. So the way in which it's brought about in this commemoration, this specific one, just to give you an example, is that instead of looking at that signifier, that it's been used, I mean, Elena Poniatowska's book is a book on martyrdom as a denunciation of the state. But here the Zapatistas drive away from it. So what they see in the 68, it's processes and practices of democracy and politics. And it's clearly stated in that text that they do not want to merely commemorate the dead or the fallen ones, or to denounce the state. What they want to do is think about 68 as a possible politics. I don't know if that answers the question.
Could I just add something else? It seems to me like one figure that seems to be important in all of this is actually Revueltas and his idea of autogestión around the whole 68 question. But I'll just leave it like that.
And I think we have time for one last question. No? No, Charles? Okay, well, thank you. Thanks, you three, for a great panel, and thank you all.